Bella sat alone in the corner of the cafe, her fingers wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, staring absent-mindedly at her phone. The soft hum of conversation filled the space, mixed with the occasional sound of a milk frother hissing from behind the counter. It was her favorite spot, a quiet corner near the window, where she could watch the world pass by without being part of it. She had come here to unwind after a long, exhausting day, but she had no idea that within minutes, her sense of peace would shatter. It started subtly, a low whistle from the table next to her. She ignored it, assuming it was not directed at her. Then, a muffled laugh, followed by a voice, too close, too deliberate. "Hey, sweetheart, you alone?" She stiffened but did not look up. Maybe if she did not engage, they would lose interest. Another voice, this one deeper. "Come on, don't be rude. We're just being friendly." Bella clenched her jaw and focused on her phone screen, pretending she had not heard. She had been in situations like this before. It was always the same. The uneasiness, the forced smiles, the fear of saying the wrong thing and making it worse. A chair scraped against the floor, and suddenly, one of them was right next to her. The man leaned in, his cologne overwhelming, his voice dripping with amusement. "What? Too good to say hello?" Bella's heart pounded. She could feel other people watching, sensing the shift in the cafe's atmosphere, but no one said anything. No one ever did. She forced herself to look up, her voice steady but firm. "I'd like to be left alone." The man smirked. "Relax, I'm just making conversation." His friend chuckled from the table. "Yeah, don't be so uptight." Bella's fingers tightened around her cup. She wanted to stand up, to walk away, but something told her they would only follow. The feeling of being trapped settled in her chest. Then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, another voice cut through the air. "That's enough." It was not loud, not aggressive, but it carried weight. A voice that made people turn. Bella looked up and saw him standing there, tall, composed, unreadable. Barron Trump. The two men hesitated, caught off guard. The smirks on their faces faltered just slightly. Barron stepped forward, his expression calm but firm. She asked to be left alone. The cafe had gone silent now. Even the baristas behind the counter had stopped moving. Bella could feel the shift in energy. Suddenly, she was not alone. One of the men scoffed, looking Barron up and down. "And who the hell are you?" Barron did not flinch. "Someone who doesn't tolerate this kind of behavior." The weight of those words settled in the air, heavy and unshakable. The entire cafe was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The cafe felt different now. The light-hearted chatter had faded into uneasy silence, and the air was thick with something unspoken. The two men who had been so bold a moment ago suddenly found themselves the center of attention. But instead of looking embarrassed, the one closest to Bella leaned back slightly, his smirk returning as if he had already decided this was some kind of joke. He scoffed, tilting his head at Barron. "Oh, so you're her bodyguard now?" His friend let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if the entire situation was ridiculous. Barron did not react. He stood his ground, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed but firm. There was no aggression in his stance, no raised voice, just a quiet confidence that made the room feel smaller. "She asked to be left alone," he repeated, his voice steady. "That means you leave her alone." The first man snorted, shifting in his seat. "Listen, man, we were just talking. She's a big girl. She doesn't need you fighting her battles." Bella felt her pulse in her throat, but this time it was not just fear. It was something else, a strange sense of disbelief. No one had ever stepped in for her like this before. She had been here before, in different places, in different moments, always hoping someone would say something, do something, but they never did. And yet, here was Barron Trump, of all people, standing between her and the two men like it was the most natural thing in the world. The second man leaned forward now, his confidence still intact. "Look, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but this isn't your problem." Barron's eyes didn't waver. "It is when someone's being harassed." The man stared at him, waiting for a reaction that never came. The silence stretched, the weight of the situation sinking in. People were watching. Phones were being pulled out. The attention was no longer on Bella. It was on them. The smirk faded from the first man's face. He exchanged a glance with his friend, something unspoken passing between them. The moment had changed. They had lost control of it. Then, with a forced chuckle, the first man raised his hands in mock surrender. "Whatever, man, we were just messing around." "Yeah," his friend added quickly. "No harm done." They stood, brushing off their jackets, suddenly eager to leave. Barron didn't move, didn't say another word, just watched as they pushed past the cafe doors and disappeared onto the street. The cafe was silent for a beat longer. Then, without warning, someone started clapping. It was quiet at first, hesitant, but then another joined in, and another. Bella exhaled, feeling the weight in her chest slowly ease. For the first time in a long time, she did not feel invisible. The applause was brief, just a few scattered claps before the cafe returned to its usual hum of conversation. But the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. The baristas behind the counter exchanged glances, a few customers still looking toward Barron and Bella, their curiosity evident. Bella sat there, her fingers still curled around her coffee cup, the warmth grounding her as she tried to process everything. Her heart was still racing, but for the first time in a long time, it was not out of fear. It was something else, something she had not felt in a while. Relief. Barron turned back to her, his face no longer carrying the sharpness from moments ago. His expression had softened, but his eyes still held a quiet intensity. "Are you okay?" His voice was lower now, just for her to hear. She swallowed, nodding slowly. "Yeah, I think so." She could still feel the adrenaline in her veins, the way her body had been bracing for something worse. It had always been that way. Whenever men like that got too close, too bold, she knew she had to stay calm, to calculate every move carefully. One wrong reaction could turn a bad situation into something dangerous. But she had not been alone this time. She exhaled and glanced around. People had gone back to their drinks and conversations, but there was a different energy in the room. A few of them gave her small, knowing looks, like they wanted to say something but did not know how. Others looked at Barron, their expressions shifting between recognition and surprise. She turned back to him, studying him properly now. She had seen his name in headlines, his face in photos, always attached to something political or controversial. But here, in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. He was just a guy who had seen something wrong and decided to do something about it. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. Barron shrugged, sliding into the chair across from her like it was nothing. "Yeah, I did." Bella let out a short, almost breathless laugh. "Most people don't." He rested his elbows on the table, lacing his fingers together. "Most people don't want to get involved. They're afraid of confrontation." She nodded, glancing down at her coffee. "Yeah, I've noticed." There was a pause. The tension from earlier was fading, replaced by something calmer. She met his gaze again. "Why did you?" Barron tilted his head slightly, thinking for a moment before answering. "Because I could." Bella studied him. It was such a simple answer, but the way he said it carried weight. Most people had the ability to help. Most people had the chance to step in. They just chose not to. Barron had chosen differently, and in that single decision, everything had changed. Bella let Barron's words settle in her mind. "Because I could." It was so simple, yet it carried more meaning than anything else she had ever heard in moments like these. She had been in situations before where she had wished, prayed, that someone, anyone, would step in, but no one ever had, until now. She took a slow sip of her coffee, feeling the warmth of it, more aware of her surroundings than before. The tension in her body was still unwinding, her muscles stiff from the instinctive defense she had built over time. Barron, however, looked completely at ease. Not cocky, not self-satisfied, just present, like this was nothing unusual for him. She placed her cup down and finally allowed herself to really look at him. He was younger than most people in the cafe, yet he carried himself differently. She had always assumed people like him, wealthy, powerful, untouchable, lived in their own worlds, disconnected from the everyday struggles of people like her. But here he was, sitting across from her, acting like what he had done was the most natural thing in the world. "Does this happen often?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. Bella hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, more than you'd think." Barron leaned back slightly, processing her words. "People just watch?" She let out a bitter chuckle. "They always do." She gestured vaguely around the cafe. "Most people just hope it stops before they have to make a choice. No one wants to be the one to step in." Barron tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "Fear," he said simply. Bella frowned. "Fear?" He nodded. "People are afraid. Not just of what could happen to them, but of saying the wrong thing, of making things worse." He glanced around the cafe, his eyes scanning the faces that had been watching earlier. "That's why they freeze. They tell themselves someone else will step in, and when no one does, it just keeps happening." Bella exhaled, resting her hands on the table. "Yeah, well, I stopped expecting anyone to step in a long time ago." Barron studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, after a beat, he said, "That's the problem." She looked up, caught off guard. "What?" "The moment people stop expecting others to step in," he said, "is the moment they accept that nothing will change." Bella opened her mouth to argue, but she could not, because deep down, she knew he was right. She had spent years assuming this was just how things were, that she had to deal with it alone, that no one would ever put themselves between her and danger. But tonight had proved otherwise. One person had stepped in. One person had changed the outcome. And if one person could do that, maybe more could. Maybe it did not have to be this way forever. Bella sat in silence for a moment, letting Barron's words sink in. The idea that expecting nothing was part of the problem had never crossed her mind before. She had learned to keep her head down, to navigate the world in a way that minimized risk, to accept that this was just how things were. But what if it did not have to be? She glanced around the cafe again. Some people had gone back to their conversations, but a few were still watching, maybe out of curiosity, maybe out of guilt. A woman sitting a few tables away gave her a small, encouraging nod. The barista who had been behind the counter now stood a little closer, as if making sure she was okay. It was subtle, but it was there. Maybe people were not indifferent. Maybe they were just waiting for someone else to act first. She looked back at Barron. You really believe people can change? He shrugged. I believe they just need a reminder. Bella exhaled. Well, you reminded them tonight. Barron smiled slightly, but there was no trace of arrogance in it, just quiet understanding. Maybe next time someone else will. She thought about that as she picked up her coffee again, but this time it did not feel like she was just trying to ground herself. It felt different, lighter. A barista approached the table, setting down a fresh cup in front of her. This one's on the house, she said softly before walking away. Bella blinked. It was such a small thing, but it meant something. A simple act of kindness, of acknowledgement. She looked at Barron again. You know, I never thought I'd meet you like this. He chuckled. Most people don't think they'll meet me at all. She smirked, shaking her head. No, I mean, not like this. Not as someone who just... She paused, trying to find the right words. As someone who just does the right thing without making it a big deal. Barron tilted his head slightly. Maybe that's the problem too. Doing the right thing shouldn't feel rare. She nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. Yeah, you're right. Barron glanced at his watch, then stood. I should go. Bella hesitated. Wait. He looked down at her. Thank you, she said. He gave her a small nod, then turned and walked out of the cafe. Bella sat there watching him disappear into the city. Something inside her had shifted, something she could not quite name. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the realization that the world was not as indifferent as she had believed. One person had changed the course of her night. One person had reminded her that people could still do the right thing. And maybe, just maybe, the next time she saw something wrong, she would not just sit and wait for someone else to act. The world does not change by itself. It changes when people choose to step in, when they choose to be the ones who break the silence. If you ever see someone in need, do not look away. Be the person who makes a difference. Because sometimes, one voice is all it takes.